You might be wondering why I'm wandering around outside in the rain, and that's a pretty valid question. Recently, I read The Simple Magic of Wild Things by Dave Gaddy. So naturally, I'm walking around my neighborhood searching for wild things. But unfortunately, since it's raining and cold, I think all the wild things are hiding. Hello up there! Anybody home? What about in here? No? Oh well, there's only one thing left to do. Operator, connect me to Dave Gaddy. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian. Today I'm speaking to Dave Gaddy. Dave is a Southern witch and the author of The Simple Magic of Wild Things. Dave, thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you. And to kick things off, could you tell everybody a little bit about your background?
Sure. I was born and raised in North Carolina. I've spent most of my childhood back and forth from the mountains to the lowlands to the hollers and everything else throughout North Carolina. I've lived in Tennessee, Georgia. I'm currently in Atlanta. But my background is primarily based, I guess you would say, because of my grandma and granny magic. Just because she was the one that, if you were with her, you learned what she knew. That was just the way she was. So I spent most of my childhood with her learning what she knew how to do, which I talk about in the book quite a bit. So
Dave, I think you said mountains and hills and a holler.
Mm-hmm.
What's a holler?
Mm-hmm. A holler is that little area between those mountains, kind of like, I guess you'd call it a valley, but technically the holler is the lowlands of the mountains, actually, where that's typically where you'll see a lot of the neighborhoods and things like that. People are still spaced out, but there's distance between them.
Okay. So as I read through your book, I definitely learned a few words that I was not familiar with. So it's always fun to learn new words. Speaking of words, on the cover and throughout the book, you spell the word witch with a Y, W-Y-T-C-H. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Sure. I think a lot of people think that something like that has to be something majorly spiritual or an epiphany of some sort. To me, I just like the spelling. I ran across it a couple years ago. It's an older English spelling, and I like the way it sounds. I like the way it looks. That's pretty much it. It's a basic thing for me. There was no big spiritual epiphany behind it. It's just, I like it, so I use it.
Okay. Makes sense. You've got exercises spaced out pretty much every chapter in the book, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the first ones was about writing your own story. So
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that like your book was kind of your own personal fulfillment of that exercise?
I think it was a start. I think that each one of us have a story, and we get to decide how that story goes. Now, a lot of people are comfortable keeping that story in the same job for 30, 40, 50 years. I think you'll find through my book that I've lived several different lives. And I think that's okay too. We have to redefine ourselves as we live our lives, as we walk through each day. You're not going to stay the same. And if you do, you become stagnant. And I believe that part of rewriting your story is finding those things that keep you stagnant and writing them out of the story. And it doesn't have to be something major. Like part of my history is when I was younger, I was a rodeo clown. But it doesn't have to be something huge like that. It could be something as simple as reintroducing yourself to a family member or bringing a certain practice into your own craft. start small. You don't have to, when you make changes, you don't have to do everything in one fell swoop.
You definitely did have several sections of your life in the book that you mentioned. You just mentioned now rodeo clown. I think for a while you said you had moved to New York to try to be an actor. And then you also worked for a while as a pastor for the Christian church. So
Yes.
how have all of these different stories and roles kind of combined to impact who you are today and how you perceive magic?
Well, I think that we'll go back to the very first part. When I moved to New York, I think that helped to build strength of character. Actually, I think it just helped build strength because I moved up there with very little money in my pocket, just honestly on a fluke, just to start working. And trust me, when people talk about the meager starts of an actor, yes, I lived in one house with 8 other people, cockroaches. Wake up in the morning, you step down and you hear a crunch. I mean, trust me, I've lived that. So you learn who you are, I think, through situations like that. The pastor part of my life, I learned witchcraft while I was working in the church. I mean, what better place to learn how to manipulate energy, how to meditate? And I started in the United Methodist Church, and then I moved to the Assemblies of God, and that's the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker denomination. But within that denomination, especially, that's where I learned, especially with music too, because I worked part of that pastorate being a praise and worship leader. So I learned that music is huge for building energy, and getting movement going. And a lot of times that's exactly what I look for when I go to the woods. I mean, you listen for the movement of the wind, you look for the movement of the trees, you look for the energy around you. And I think that the pastorate prepared me for that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. A lot of people that I have talked to recently on the show have had quite a lengthy bit of time spent in the Christian church. And a lot of what was pulled from that was lots of musical experience. And I know for me, I was in the church for like the first 18 years of my life. I was in the choir, played instruments in the church band. I got a lot of musical experience. I had a lot of like that spirituality is something that I was seeking. It was just, not the right house, not the right place. Same spirituality I was seeking, but not the right place for me to seek it in. So that's always been interesting to see those similar connecting threads in other people's stories. And speaking more about kind of writing those stories down, can you talk a little bit about the role that a journal plays in a lot of the exercises in your book?
Oh my gosh, I'm huge on journaling. I think it helps you to put thoughts to word, because a lot of times when I'm sitting there trying to think of something, it's not going to flesh out the way that I could flesh it out on paper. It's just like when I start with trust me, my notes on my iPad are full. When I start writing a book, I mean, I start with an outline, then I start fleshing out each chapter. And when I say fleshing out, it's giving voice to those who came before us, like with my grandma. I talk a lot about her in this book, and I feel like that not only honors her spirit, but also brings her back to life for me quite a bit. And I think that when you journal, it's just like, and I know that a lot of therapists recommend journaling too. And I think that's where it started. Just because it's good to get those emotions out. And I think that some of us who don't necessarily have people that are willing to listen 24/7, when you're able to write it down, it's like, okay, this is valid. I'm really feeling this. This is something that I need to either pursue this way or look at eliminating from my life. So, like I said, journaling is huge for me just because it puts your voice in a tangible form so that you can actually see what you're working through.
When was the first time you started journaling?
10th grade.
Yeah.
Don't ask me to go back in years. I mean, I'm 58 now. You can do the math.
Is that just something you kind of naturally felt drawn to doing, or was it
I
a
was
recommendation?
I was introduced to it, honestly, in high school through a particular class that I took. It was called a Quest class. And in that class, it was kind of a get to know yourself type of class. And we were required to journal every week and turn it in. So can you imagine that poor teacher reading through all that teenage angst? Exactly. Even when I was working in the school system, I mean, I don't know that I would have ever told a child to turn in a journal entry with everything that they're going through.
Yeah. I don't envy that teacher or their workload. So you mentioned your grandmother. That's Mama, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about her and what her influence was on your craft.
Gosh, everything about her influenced it. The first thing you have to know is Mama was a character. There was no apprehension of being who she was wherever she was. If she felt like singing in the middle of a parking lot, she would do it. I mean, that was just Mama. If you were standing in the kitchen and you saw her start towards you, moving her body and her hands like that, you knew you were about to dance in the kitchen. I mean, that was just her. And I can remember her, some of the practical things. I can remember her going out in the yard when she didn't necessarily have anything for dinner that night, going and catching a squirrel, and that squirrel was put in the pot for dinner. And I talk about a lot of that in the chapter called Don't Look in the Pot. But she was a scrappy woman. I mean, this woman went for what she wanted and nothing stood in her way. I can remember when she was in her, 70s or 80s, she went to a senior citizen dance and my Aunt Janelle was there, and my Aunt Janelle made a play for the man that she was interested in. And my grandma beat the tar out of that woman. And this was not her sister. This was my mom's side of the family, but my grandma was my dad's mom. But that was the way she was. I mean, she influenced every piece of everything. I mean, she was the one that said, "Do you know what type tree this is?" Country through and through. She loved to tell us stories. She loved to, and I think that's a big part of how my book is laid out, because she taught us to be storytellers. I mean, when you sat down with her on the porch to either string beans or shell peas, you got stories. I mean, I can remember her telling stories of my dad growing up, how he used to be horrible about catching wasps and pulling their wings off. And she told him that the devil was going to get him for doing that. And there was one day he was sitting on the porch and a bat swooped down at him, and he came running into the house screaming, "The devil's after me, the devil's after me." And she used to tell us that story over and over again. So to me, that falls into magic too, because if you think about it, magic is honestly, that's your story. And the way you convey that story is who you are. And she would tell us, I mean, gosh, she used to scare us to death with stories of the booger woods, and she would tell us stories about our kinfolk and our uncles and aunts and everything. And just the first thing that she built in me was that sense of belonging, that ancestry. That there were always kinfolk from your past that were looking out for you. And she's very much a culmination of what my great grandma Thula was, or great great grandma Thula. And you'll read about Thula in the book too. She was the family matron. She had kids, each by a different daddy, never married. And she was okay with that. She didn't feel like she owed anybody a reason or an excuse. They came at her and said that she needed to be made an honest woman. And she's like, I am an honest woman. She's like, my kids eat, my kids have clothes, my kids go to school. She's like, my kids don't go without. She's like, I don't need a man to do any of that. So I think it was always kind of a fierce sense of independence that was bred into us.
Okay. I have several follow-up here questions, Dave. However, before I start going through those questions, I have another definition request. Can you explain the booger woods?
A booger is essentially a ghost, a monster, a spirit, something like that. I mean, and it can vary from area to area. And the booger woods was a little patch of woods that was close to where my grandma lived as a kid. And they were always told not to go into the booger woods because there was a headless hog that would chase you through and would get you essentially. And the story in the booger woods is that her and her brother Bill or Billy were out, or was it Bobby? I don't have the book in front of me, but they were standing outside the booger woods, and her brother told her that he was going through the woods, that it was too long to go around them to get home. And she's like, I'm not going through those. My mama warned me. So he goes through. Well, while she's walking around, all she hears is him screaming and running and yelling, and meets him on the other end. And he's like, there was this headless hog with red eyes. And she'd get so mad at me because I'm like, how does a headless hog have red eyes? And she's like, don't question me. You just listen to the story. But the booger woods to me, when I think about it, it reminds me of a part of our own journey. There are places that we're scared to go, but we have to go through them anyway. And I think that's what I glean from that story is, even though something's scary to you, sometimes you just have to press through, let the things that are in there chase you, let them pursue you. You just have to run a little bit faster.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that definition. That was, that part of the book made me chuckle a little bit with questioning how the headless hog had eyes if he didn't have a head. But another couple questions that I was thinking about as you were talking was, you said your grandma was real connected to the land, and she was always kind of like telling you and teaching you stuff like what kind of tree this is, or I guess like how to watch the animals and learn what is impending based on their behaviors. So did anybody at the time call this magic? Was this just the norm?
That was more the norm. It's just like if you would have asked my grandmother back then if she was a witch, she would have denied it. But it was kind of like, and this is prevalent in Appalachian folk magic, you see a lot of the Bible interspersed with witchcraft. And they won't typically call it witchcraft. They may call it magic to a degree, but it's more referred to as a spirituality of type.
Yeah, because there's a lot of like Christian imagery and Christian words that get intermingled with it, but it's still kind of, at its core, it's the same elements as witchcraft and magic. What exactly makes up Appalachian magic?
Oh my gosh, I think it's such a culmination of different things based on the region. And I've talked to different people in different areas, and like people who have lived in Tennessee, it's completely different from North Carolina. And as you know, the Appalachian Mountains extend all the way up north. And people just kind of automatically assume that Appalachian folk magic encompasses just the southern. And that's not necessarily true. It's more of a people group rather than a region. I mean, as far as the region yes, it goes. It's related to living around and near and in the Appalachian Mountains, but also it extends so much further than that. Because if you look, even in North Carolina, when we were living in Monroe, right below Charlotte, you even got the spillover from Appalachian folk magic, just because of the location. We also had a lot of influence from the Gullah people in South Carolina. I had an aunt that lived in Charleston, so every time I went down there, I got a good dose of that. Um, and you also get things that kind of find their way into the local legends and the local magic. Just like one of the things my grandma was strong about was talking about haints. And haints is pretty much a Gullah thing, and hoodoo and things like that. But there was still that knowledge of, and how do you keep them out of the house? I mean, there's still so many houses around that they paint the ceiling haint blue just to keep people out, or keep the spirits out, not people, but to keep those spirits out.
I actually had haint on the list of things to ask you about. So can you explain a little bit about like exactly what that is, where that comes from, who the Gullah people are, and then how you protect against the haint?
Okay, so the Gullah people, from what I learned growing up, are the African people that were brought over as slaves. They brought part of their belief system with them. And a haint, a lot of people think that it's a ghost. It's not necessarily a ghost. It's a malevolent spirit. And you don't want them in the house. You don't want them to, it almost, based on what I've learned over the years, it's kind of like having a poltergeist. They're not nice, they're not friendly, and they're out to hurt you. So a lot of our childhood was spent building those fortresses against the haints, making sure that it was haint blue, making sure that the floors were washed with a certain thing, or making sure that we were girded up, so to speak, the way my grandma would put it, because there was a verse that she used to use in the Bible talking about gird up your loins, essentially with the armor of God. And that was part of the protection from the haints, as well as people who would try to do you harm. So, like I said, a haint to me is not a ghost. That's too woo-woo. A haint to me is more of a malevolent spirit, something that's out to hurt you.
So what color is haint blue?
Oh my gosh. I think too that's a regional thing, because when I've seen it, like I went to Savannah not too long ago, and their version of haint blue is almost a paler shade. I've seen some places when they use haint blue, it's a darker shade of blue, not navy, but a muted shade of a bright blue. So I think it varies just from region to region.
Okay, no, that makes total sense. What kind of stuff did you use as a floor wash?
Oh, anything from vinegar to herbs mixed in. And I mean, I've seen my grandma use water with rosemary thrown into it. And I mean, just pretty much whatever she had in the garden that might work for protection. And I mean, I've seen her use things that I know most witches nowadays wouldn't say, oh, that's a protection herb. But I think, too, that a lot of folk magic is using what you got. I mean,
Yeah.
anything can be anything, to be honest. There are no rules in the craft. Well, there are rules, but a lot of the rules typically tend to be man-made, but we won't go there.
Yeah, I think in modern witchcraft, we've gotten a little spoiled by what we have access to, because I can drive a few minutes down the road and I can walk into an herb store that has every different kind of herb from all different places around the world imported. And a little bit about what we have lost is our own personal connection to growing those things and being involved in the things that are directly around us and the cycles of those things as well. And you talk a lot about that connection to the land and to the spirits and, to the creatures of the land. So could you talk a little bit about how you see those things?
I was always taught that from my grandma that everything has a spirit. Everything has a purpose, whether you like it or not. I mean, the only things that I'm scared of are rats and things that look like rats, but that came from childhood trauma. But the thing is, like with her, she would talk to everything that she came in contact with. She talked to the squirrels, she talked to the chipmunks, she talked to the dogs, the cats, the cows, you name it. She talked to them. If she needed more eggs that week, she went out and had a little conversation with the hens. So it's kind of something that even when I had pets, and right now I'm in a house with no pets, but even when I had pets, my Chihuahua I talked to like he was a human. I mean, it was kind of like Frisbee. We don't need to be doing that or stuff like that. But that's how she approached day to day life. I mean, she would go out, and if she had an old cow that she needed just a little bit more milk from, and she wasn't sure that cow was going to be able to do it, she had a heart to heart with that cow. Or if there was a snake that crossed her path, and my grandma wasn't really afraid of anything, but she was one that didn't taunt things either. She would be like, okay, Mr. Snake, I'm going to let you go on your way. You go that way, and I'm going to go this way. So you don't bother me, and I'm not going to bother you. So that was kind of the way that I was taught. And even growing up in the country, a lot of times I'd get gone, and Mama would find me out by the lake behind the house with a couple of dogs laid up on me and chickens and everything else. And that was normal. Because, I mean, that's the way my whole family grew up. The only thing my dad requested is that I didn't talk to him in public.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned only being afraid of one type of animal, rats and things that look like rats. So I think you put one of those animals on the cover of the book.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. Why did you choose to put that on the cover?
I didn't. Actually, my editor did. And it was so funny because that's one of the animals that I've always been deathly afraid of, just because it looks like a giant rat. And in the book, I talk about my grandma trying to teach me how to cook one. And all that did was build the trauma, because all I can remember is seeing that big old rat like critter being pulled out of the oven, basted in its own grease with a persimmon in its mouth, with its teeth still in, grinning like crazy. And she's telling me, don't you want to taste it? And I'm like, no, I do not. But what's so funny is I found that as I get older, the possum shows itself more and more. Even when I go out into the woods, there was this big ambling possum, or even taking the trash down to the dumpster in the apartment complex. One night I was walking with my roommate to the dumpster, and there was a possum and a cat standing face to face. Now, I probably broke up a fight because I screamed real loud and ran the opposite direction. And then they shot away. So, and then last week we found a dead possum in the courtyard, and we get them every so often in there, but not very often. And this was a pretty big female possum. So I believe that each animal's got something to teach us. Possum can teach us quite a bit. They're very family oriented. They're very protective. If you think about it, they're resilient. They don't catch rabies. They eat things that bother us humans, like ticks, mosquitoes, things like that. So everything has its own helpful energy. And it's just a matter of learning from them and learning how to apply that energy. So I've tried, even with the fear of possums, to learn to appreciate them and what they offer, and to learn from the spirit of the possum. What can I learn from them? Truthfully, I think the biggest thing I could learn is don't be bothered with the little things. Just chew them up and spit them out, like ticks, mosquitoes, things like that.
That's a hard
But when the
lesson.
bigger things hit, if you'll notice, a possum goes into that play dead mode. I think there's some wisdom in there too. Learn how to not let it bother you. Isolate yourself to the point that you're you can deal with it, but not be overwhelmed by it.
I actually found that part of the book to be quite interesting. You listed a few different animals and what you think their lessons are that we can learn from them. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about that? You talked about the possum, but maybe like,
Hmm.
the squirrels or the snakes or the crows.
Oh my gosh, there's so much that you can learn from I mean, if you just think about the crow, a lot of people in witchcraft communities see the crow as a bad omen. I've never seen that. I've always seen the crow as a very protective energy, to the point that when I hear a crow call outside, I'm automatically comforted. It means I've got something watching out for me, somebody watching out for me. Chipmunks, if you look at them, it's always busyness. I mean, they're always about something. They're always doing something. They don't seem to settle down much. And I think with us, we have to learn to be busy, but we've also got to learn to take those quiet times. It's just like we've got a squirrel around here that loves to get into the cushions of the patio furniture and use the material for the nest. But if you look at a squirrel, it's always about being prepared for any situation. And in building that nest, they want to make sure it's fortified and strong enough that just the regular old storm's not going to knock that nest out of that tree. Um, Snakes. I've never been afraid of a snake just because we had so many that would show up when I lived in North Carolina. I mean, we were constantly pulling snakes out of bird boxes or out of the chicken coop and things like that. But if you look at a snake, it's essentially, I know that a lot of Christians tend to associate the snake with the devil, but with me, it's more of an adaptability thing. Because if you look at a snake, because they're cold blooded, they tend to conserve their energy. So that, like most cold blooded animals, are going to lay in the sun to conserve that heat. That way, they've got it to take with them. And I think that we could learn a lot from each animal, learn how to preserve our energy. Not everything deserves that energy. I tend to try to stay away from what they call the witch wars, I guess. Don't care. I mean, I understand that there are going to be beefs within the community, just like there were in the church, but I choose to keep myself out of it. It's not worth my time, not worth my energy, and all it does is detract from what you're doing. Um, by nature, I am a worrier, just to let you know that, and I live with constant anxiety, but I try to keep it under control. Am I always successful? No, I'm not. Um, just like this morning, I woke up in a start and started my day with anxiety, but I had to tone it down, calm it down, be ready to move through the day just as I needed to without living it anxiously. But I believe each animal teaches us something like that. If you look at the fox, um, it teaches us how to be cautious and still live amongst. I mean, if you look at it down here, we see fox constantly. They're in the woods, they're on the sides of the road, and not necessarily being run over, but I mean, they're over just always observant, it seems like. And I think we could learn a lot from that. If you watch more than you say, it tends to build wisdom. But a lot of times we feel like we have to give our opinion on everything, and it's not necessarily needed. If you think about when somebody's dealing with something, a lot of times they don't need advice, they just need an ear. And I think that's important when you go into a situation like that. Ask somebody, do you just want me to listen, or do you need me to give you input?
I really love all those animal interpretations. I find a lot of times that I'm noticing a particular animal coming across my path more often. And I wonder for a while, like, what kind of message are you bringing for me? Fun story, actually, Dave. So there is a section of the book where you're talking about kind of like your animal allies, so to speak, and you talk about the crow and how this crow followed you around for a period of time, and it would follow you to friends' houses and sit in their trees until you left. So I read that chapter, and then a couple days later, my wife and I were going around our neighborhood for a walk, and we had stopped to feed some of the squirrels and ducks, and there was a crow kind of hopped up behind us, didn't get super close to us, and then flew up into the tree that was over top of us. And then we started walking, and I saw in the shadow overhead, I saw the shadow of a crow go over us again. Went to the next tree, followed us around the entire neighborhood, just hopping from tree to tree to be above us. And I was thinking, like, that's interesting. I guess we made a new friend. So I put some crackers on the ground, and then as I walked away, he or she swooped down and ate a little bit. But it's always fun to make a new animal ally. I hope I see them again.
Well, and the thing that impresses me about crows is the memory. I mean, they'll remember that. They'll remember that you fed them. So once you have one as an ally, you've got that one for life, it seems like.
I'll keep my eye out for the crow as we go on future walks. Something I wanted to ask you about as well is, how do you see ancestral work? Because you talk about your grandmother and your great grandparents and their stories and everything. And what's your recommendation for people being able to connect to their ancestors?
Ask. It's that simple. I think a lot of people look at ancestral worship as something that's kind of, spirits of my ancestors. I don't. I talk to them the way I would in life. I mean, if I'm having a hard day and I need the spirit of my grandmother to intercede, I go to her like I would have when she was here. It's just like, Mama, I'm having a hard day. It's rough. One of the ancestors that I talk about in my book is my Uncle Zeb. And Uncle Zeb had the sight, is what my grandma told me, which essentially meant that he heard spirits, he talked to spirits, or was able to talk to spirits, but he didn't know how to control those voices. So that's what essentially led him to commit suicide. But with Zeb is one of those that can teach you things. Like, this is what I couldn't deal with in life, but this is how I learned to deal with it after. And I think that's important, is not only learning from their lives, but learning from them in death too. I mean, there have been nights that I've gone to sleep and had dreams about several of my ancestors just circled around me. I mean, my grandma, my uncle, my aunts. And I don't believe that those are accidental dreams. I believe that they're there for a purpose. And it's just like, I'll never forget when my Aunt Carolyn was dying from lung cancer. It was the day that she died in hospice. And I can remember my grandmother going to her and leaning in to give her a goodbye kiss. And she said, I'm not going to be far behind. And she wasn't. I mean, it was a matter of months, honestly. But the fact that she knew that, and I feel like even then she was working with my aunt as an ancestor.
That is pretty powerful. I mean, how can somebody, aside from just asking, how can somebody kind of get started? I think you had a little ritual for connecting to your ancestors in the book.
Research is huge. Find out who they are. Ask your relatives. I mean, it's just like with my dad. He keeps a lot of stuff. So I've got pictures and I've got things that he's got, that documents, things like that. But like with my grandma Thula, my dad was the one that told me about the fact that she had all these kids, no husband, and everything like that. I mean, this is stuff that they don't record in Ancestry.com.
Mm-hmm.
You have to rely on the people that knew them to give you that history. That's why it was important for me to be able to sit down with my grandmother while we were shelling beans or shelling peas and learn those stories of the people that had gone on before. And I mean, she took me back. Oh my gosh, I could tell you stories about the Hildreths and the pigs and all that. And yes, her last name was Pig, Pigg, before she got married. Um, but I think that's a huge part. Just get to know them. Do your work, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about in my next book. Do the work. You can't ride on somebody's coattails for magic. And even if you come from a history of a magical family or a family of witches, don't rest on your laurels. Don't get comfortable with what they passed down. Do the work yourself.
Very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's coming up in that upcoming work?
The new book is actually called Be the Witch That You Are, Calling Back Your Power. And that actually came because of a mentor of mine. Her name was Cindy Maluna. She's since passed from cancer a couple of years ago. And one of the things that she would always say whenever I was feeling sorry for myself or just kind of licking my own wounds was she'd say, "For the love of God, be the witch that you are." Or in her case, she'd say, "For the love of Goddess, be the witch that you are." She's like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just do what needs to be done. So a lot of the book, this next book is my journey through learning to be who I am. The first chapter is called I Knew Who I Wanted to Be. And it's essentially going to talk about how I learned who I was. And that takes a lot of self-reflection because I can remember even as a young adult, just being a people pleaser, so concerned about what everybody thought about me, scared of somebody saying something bad or something like that. I don't care anymore. I really do not care. And my grandma taught me all of that. I mean, somebody can say something about me, but can they eat me? Well, they could, but I'm going to make it hard and I'm going to kick all the way down. But that's just it. It's being you unapologetically. And I think that's the key because so many of us as witches kind of fall into, well, I want to be like that person. That I want to practice like that person. I want to do this. I want to do that. I think when you go back in history to witches, the Scottish witches, the English witch, I mean, before America was even America, they didn't practice based on somebody else. They practiced based on who they were, where they were, and what they had. And I'll never be Matt Oren. I'll never be Devin Hunter, but I'll always be me. Am I going to make mistakes? Yeah. I've got to be willing to apologize if I hurt somebody. I've got to be willing to take responsibility for me. I can't take responsibility for anybody else, but I am who I am, and that's what the book is about. Learning to be unapologetically you and learning to practice your craft that way.
Do we have a timeline on release date for the book?
I think they said Sven was talking about summer of 2025.
Okay.
So I'm kind of shooting for a June date.
Awesome. Definitely something to keep my eye out for. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is in one of the chapters, you said how words and encouragement are magic. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Think about it this way. If I look at you and I say, you are such an amazing person. How does that make you feel automatically?
That makes me feel pretty good.
Exactly. So we forget that our words hold power. And when it comes to other people, you don't know what they're going through at the time. You don't know how hard their life is. And sometimes just one little word may help. And I'm not talking about just vomiting, just compliment after compliment after compliment. I mean, be genuine. It's just like if I see somebody that I know is struggling, but I also know that there's potential in there for something huge, I'm going to let them know that I see that potential. It's like looking at an acorn and seeing an oak tree. I mean, everybody has something built into them, whether they think it or not. And we have to be able to look at people and see potential. We have to be able to look at everything and see potential. I mean, it's just like I look at my roommate. My roommate is probably one of the smartest people I know. I mean, this man studies languages in his free time. That's huge. I mean, am I going to tell him that's stupid that you do that? No, because I think that's amazing. I mean, to learn dead languages like Latin just in your free time, that's huge. Same thing with the craft. I mean, if somebody's doing something that may not be revolutionary, but it may make a difference, they need to know that. And it's about building people up, not tearing people down. And if you look at religion in general is horrible about that. Mm-hmm. If you look at Christianity, it's all about, it's so much you're worth less than what you are. And the only way that you can be made worthy is through this other individual or this deity. I don't believe that. I believe that as humans, we're automatically worthy. It's just a matter of learning to see it. And sometimes you can only see it in yourself through somebody else. Because if you think about day-to-day life, we're beat down so much. I mean, think about your job. How many times do you seriously get, you are doing such a great job? Not very often. And it's just like right now, all I'm hearing is productivity, 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 productivity. It wears you out. Tell me that you appreciate something I'm doing or that I'm doing something well, and it's going to get me a lot. It's going to get a lot farther. Just hearing that's going to increase my productivity. Not necessarily hearing you say, I need you to up your productivity, up your productivity. I mean, that gets old, and it's defeatist. And I don't want to be that way in the craft. I want somebody to know that I see something good that they're doing. It's just like I look at everything happening in North Carolina now as a result of the hurricane. I see so many witches coming together to offer hope, to offer basic human needs to people. Have I seen much from the church? Not as much. But I am seeing all over Facebook, all over social media, different covens coming together to pull in for the needs of the people. I see people out there doing things for people they don't even know. I saw a post the other day about a group of Guatemalan men who are out there with chainsaws, cutting trees to get them out of the way, to make it workable for the power people. And I think that's how witchcraft should be. Let's help other people get things that aren't needed out of the way so that they can concentrate on their craft.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And one of the stories that I appreciated in the book, I think you were working in a facility with some patients, and there was a woman who was telling you, I love you all the time. And that's kind of where this lesson came up a little bit. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. And that's something we were always taught. And part of what I talk about in the book is the fear that we grew up with because of my mom. And at some point in her life, that fear kind of dissipated. But she was afraid of everything. And one of those things was people with mental disabilities or issues. So when I was in Bible school in Tennessee, one of the first projects we had to do was go work in a mental health facility. It scared me to death just because, and I'm sure that it was the difference between them and me. But then again, once you get in there and you look in somebody's eyes and you see that there's not much of a difference, like with her, she would walk around and it was, I love you. And most people wouldn't respond. It was just something she did. But the first time that I looked at her and I said, I love you too, she looked at me and she said, for real? And I went, for real. And she never did it again. It's just like one of the things that I had to do as a part of that job was there was a person that they put me with who was essentially a paraplegic, not a paraplegic, quadriplegic, and he couldn't feed himself. So they put me in charge of feeding him. So here I was sitting there feeding this fella, and he was laughing and just having the best time. Well, here I am sitting a bundle of nerves, and I realized that he's no different than I am. He just can't move. And when that realization hit me, I remember the emotions just kind of balling up and just coming out. I'm sitting there with tears running down my face, and he looks at me and I hear, no cry, no cry, happy, happy. But he didn't understand that those were tears of happiness, that there was a realization that had to happen. And I don't have that paranoia anymore. I'm not scared of people who are different from me. More than likely, I'm probably going to approach them first. And I think that's a lot of, I mean, I look at the craft and I see that we're scared of what's different. And if you think about the arguments that happen within those practices, it's about the differences. It's not about the similarities. So if we just learn to look for the similarities instead of the difference, and I'm not one of those that's going to gatekeep or say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Now, culturally, yeah, I mean, use common sense. But as far as practitioners, we're not so different. Let's embrace the similarities. Don't look for what we can call out as being wrong.
Yeah. Definitely agree with you there. There's more similarities in everything than there are differences, but a lot of people just get caught up in the differences. It's about time to get to the signature question here, Dave. But before I do that, I do want to hear from you where people can find you online, how people can get in touch or find your work, stuff like that.
I'm on Facebook under Dave Gaddy. That's my personal profile, but I also use it as a witchy profile too. I also have a page called The Weathered Wise Man on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, weathered_wise_man_real. I'm at different conferences through the year. Typically, if I'm not teaching at one, I'm still attending, like Sacred Space in Baltimore, Mystic South here in Atlanta, and different things like that. So it's not hard to find me. You can Google me and I'll pop up, kind of like a bad dream.
Okay, well, for anybody looking for information, I will take all those links and I will post them in the video description below. So you won't even have to Google it. You just got to click and you'll find Dave. So, Dave, signature question here. How do you use sound or music in your personal magical practice?
Oh my gosh, sound and music constantly. I mean, it's just like I was telling you earlier, I'll get to singing around the house and I'll be told to hush. But a lot of times, like if I go out into the woods, I'm whistling. I mean, my grandmother taught me growing up how to whistle up the wind. And sometimes you just have to lose your inhibitions. And I think that that's a part of what music does for me. I mean, I've constantly got my headphones on. I go to sleep listening to binaural beats and podcasts and things like that. So it's a huge part of just that comfort for me, because growing up, my grandmother loved to live vicariously through me. That's why I learned how to play guitar. That's how I learned to play piano. That's where I learned to sing. I mean, I can remember her, like I said, if you were in the kitchen and she started moving towards you, you knew you were going to dance, and you didn't say no. And the same thing with, and my roommate will tell you that if I'm feeling myself, especially here in the house, you'll see me just start dancing. I think that's a carryover from my grandma. But especially like when I go out into the woods, that's my time just to kind of sing. And I encourage people, when you go into nature, learn to dance with the wind. Learn to sing with the birds. Listen to the songs of the birds. Listen. That's a huge part of it too, listening. It's just like, I know that Agatha All Along is the huge contemporary let's get on the bandwagon thing right now. But one of the songs that was done in the second episode is called The Ballad of the Witch's Road. That song is huge. And even in my listening to it, I decided that, okay, I wanted to write something that was a little bit more non-binary. So for those who don't necessarily follow the Maiden Mother Crone teachings, that way there was something out there that they could use. And I posted that on Facebook. But it's like I said, music's been ingrained, ingrained in me since I was young. I mean, I can remember my grandmother, a lot of times we'd just sit on the porch and she'd sing. And I remember one called Uncle Noah's Ark, and the kids loved it. It was a long, long time ago. You folks, you ought to know that Uncle Noah built himself an ark. For 40 days and nights, the rain was sure bright. The animals like tore the ark apart. The duck went quack, the cow went moo, the rooster said cock-a-doodle-doo, the old tomcat he raised an awful row. The billy goat bad, the froggy said, it's the awfulest rain we've ever had. The horses and cattle and fowl of the air, even the long-eared donkey was there. Duck went quack, cow went moo, the rooster said cock-a-doodle-doo, and all was there on Uncle Noah's Ark. I mean, that was the type of stuff we grew up on. Set Your Fields on Fire. Oh my gosh, I can remember her singing that over and over and over again. That's an old church hymn. And like I said, even when I was in the church, the praise and worship was a huge part of building energy. And it's the same thing when I do my own practices. Even if I don't sing it out loud, I'm either humming something, or something's going through my head. So that's a huge part of the practice. I think it helps with the flow. It helps with the energy. It helps you to just kind of forget all the troubles of the day and just kind of be about the business at hand.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of whistling with the wind, or dancing with the wind, or just listening and hearing the bird song. There is a lot of music all around us if we can just be still enough to hear it.
And it's just like, even with the dancing with the wind, I can remember when I would take my chihuahua out, and sometimes here in the South, you get those little circles of wind where the leaves and the flower petals are caught up. And I can remember watching him just kind of chase those petals and the leaves. And to me, that was his version of dancing with the wind. So in my mind, I've still got that memory.
Those were magic when I was a kid. We'd see the little circles of leaves, and we'd try to jump in them before they disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dave, we've kind of hit our time here, so I appreciate you coming on the show, and had a great time speaking with you.
Thank you for having me, and I've had so much fun.
All right, I'll go ahead and end our call now. Appreciate you, Dave.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Another great interview, and another big M3 thank you to Dave Gaddy for taking the time to be with me on the show today. If you haven't already checked out his book, The Simple Magic of Wild Things, be sure to grab a copy. I'll post the link in the video description below. Please remember to like and subscribe here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Eric Arcadian. But if you'd really like to help support me making more content in the future, be sure to check out my Patreon page. Patrons get exclusive perks like the opportunity to download my music. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.